It was just another day on the farm, but something about that day touched me deeply. Sometimes we think that routine hides emotions, but I soon discovered that I was wrong. My nephew Jimmy and I were together, but something inside me began to change as I watched him. But before we dive into that story, tell us which state you are watching this video from. And if you enjoyed this touching story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a morning like any other on the farm. The sun had barely begun to warm the horizon, and I was already standing, adjusting my work boots while listening to the bird song. The smell of fresh earth filled the air, and for a brief moment, I felt at peace, as I always do here. The farm is my refuge, especially after Henry left. But that day, there was something else, something in the air that I couldn't explain. A feeling that, in some way, would change everything. Jimmy, my nephew. He was spending a few days with me to help with the chores. He was always a nice, helpful, and caring guy. He had been offering to help for a while, but I only recently accepted. Since Henry passed away, the farm has been my lonely companion, and although I love Jimmy, I knew his presence would bring up feelings that I might prefer to keep buried. While he was in the stable, arranging the hay with those strong arms, I watched from afar. There was something about his stance, his strength, it reminded me so much of Henry when he was young. I felt my heart tighten. A pang of longing mixed with something else, something I didn't dare admit, not even to myself. My thoughts were interrupted when he turned and smiled at me, that bright smile that always seems to light up the room. "Auntie, is everything okay?" he asked, and I quickly composed myself, responding with a nod. But deep down, I already knew that day would be different. I don't think I realized it at the time, but my mind was being taken back to times I'd rather forget. Jimmy's every gesture brought back memories of a past that I believed was dormant. As Jimmy worked, his every move reminded me more of Henry. It was like I was seeing a ghost. A younger version of the man I loved so much. My heart sank every time he smiled or called me aunt in that soft voice, so similar to his uncle's. The time we spent together on the farm was always simple, peaceful, but this time, something was different. When you spend so much time alone, your emotions are stored in deep compartments, under lock and key. But somehow Jimmy was opening doors I didn't even know existed. As the sun rose and the midday heat took over, he came to me, sweaty and tired, but with that ever-present smile. "Do you want help, Aunt?" he asked. I shook my head, trying to push away the thoughts that insisted on tormenting me. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something that made me look away, embarrassed. Something that made me uncomfortable, something I knew I needed to understand. As the day progressed, I realized there was something strange going on inside me. It was a mix of emotions that I couldn't explain. How could I feel so much affection for him, at the same time that a strange weight began to grow in my heart? Jimmy and I were always together on the farm, taking care of the daily chores. He was agile and strong, with contagious energy, and his presence made me feel alive again. But there was something more. I don't know how to explain it, but with each passing day, the affection I felt for him seemed to take on other forms. It wasn't just familial affection. It was deeper, more intense, and it scared me. I remember. Give me a special afternoon. We were finishing feeding the animals when Jimmy came over and put his hand on my shoulder. A simple gesture, I know, but at that moment, I felt my heart accelerate like it hadn't happened in a long time. I knew it wasn't right, I knew these feelings shouldn't be there, but I couldn't shake them. He noticed something was wrong. "Auntie, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I smiled, trying to hide the turmoil inside me. "Sure, Jimmy. I'm just tired, that's all." But he looked at me as if he knew I was hiding something, and that only made everything more difficult. Something between us had changed. We hadn't yet talked about what was happening, but it was clear that we both felt the weight of new tension. How can we deal with these feelings without losing what we had? The days passed and the silence between Jimmy and I became heavier. I avoided any situation that could generate too much closeness. But at the same time, I longed for his company. It was a confusion of feelings that left me on the verge of tears when I was alone. He also seemed distant, as if he felt the same strangeness but never talked about it. Just looks and gestures, loaded with a meaning that I didn't want to accept. One night, we were sitting on the porch after a long day of work. The starry sky, the silence of the farm, everything seemed so perfect until he broke the silence. "Auntie, do you feel something different between us?" His question came as a blow. My heart raced, and for a moment, I couldn't respond. How could I admit something like that? But, at the same time, I knew I couldn't lie to him. "Jimmy, I don't know what to say." The words came out in a whisper. He didn't insist, but the weight of our unspoken conversation remained there, between us, thick as the air of that summer night. That night changed everything. I knew we couldn't go on like this, with something unsaid between us. It was time to face the truth and decide what we would do with our feelings. After that night, I lay awake for hours, thinking about what Jimmy had said and how I felt. I have always been a practical woman, with my feet on the ground, but I never imagined that. At 62 years old, I would face such a complicated situation. How do I explain this to my own head, let alone my heart? I had to be strong. Jimmy was my family, the boy I helped raise, and now, those feelings were leading us down a dangerous path. At breakfast, I could barely look at him. I focused on my cup of coffee, hoping he wouldn't bring it up, but I knew it wouldn't go away on its own. We couldn't just ignore what was happening. "Auntie, about last night." He started, but I raised my hand, asking him to stop. "Jimmy, we can't do this." My words came out firm, but my heart was in pieces. I knew that, no matter what happened, our relationship would never be the same. "I love you, but this isn't right." He didn't respond right away, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He knew I was right, but he also felt the same way. The fine line between familial love and something more had been crossed, and now we needed to find a way to deal with it. I knew that what I felt for him went beyond what an aunt should feel. It was a forbidden feeling, but before I decided what to do, I needed to face my own heart. I was silent for a long moment after saying that we couldn't go on like this. There was so much to process, so many conflicting feelings. But the worst part of all was that, deep in my heart, I knew he was in love with me too. It wasn't just in my head. "No, it's not right," he began to say, hesitantly. "But what I feel for you, Aunt, is real. I've never felt this way for anyone before." My breathing stopped for a second. The weight of his words was overwhelming. But at the same time, hearing them brought a strange relief, like we were finally being honest with each other. "Jimmy, you can't talk like that. I'm your aunt," I said, but my voice was shaky. "This is a mistake, we can't continue." He approached, holding my hands gently. "I know it's complicated. I know you're confused, but, Auntie, I can't ignore how I feel." My heart beat wildly, while my thoughts raced. I knew I had to be the responsible adult here, but what do you do when your heart is at odds with your reason? Even with everything he said, I knew the responsibility fell on me. It was a crossroads that could change our lives forever. Jimmy looked me in the eyes, as if he was waiting for an answer that could change everything. I, on the other hand, was struggling with my own heart. How could it be possible to feel something like that about him? He was my nephew, part of my family. But at the same time, he was a man who made me feel things I had never experienced before. I needed to get away, take some distance, to clear my mind. Jimmy, I need some time to think. This is all too heavy for me, I said, removing my hands from his gently. He didn't try to convince me anymore. He just nodded, with a look of mixed sadness and understanding. It's okay, Auntie. I don't want to force anything. I just want you to know how I feel. That moment hung in the air for a while. The decision I knew I had to make weighed on me like a rock. Should I ignore these feelings and carry on as if nothing had happened? Or would I have the courage to face what we felt and deal with the consequences? After spending days reflecting, I finally made the decision. It was risky, uncertain, but I knew it was what my heart wanted. In the days following that conversation with Jimmy, the confusion in my mind seemed to increase. Every time I thought about him, a mixture of fear and desire enveloped me. Could something really happen between us? Or was it all just an impossible daydream? I went out to the farm porch one night, the moon lighting up the fields, and I sat there for hours, listening to the sounds of the night, trying to hear my own heart. There, enveloped by calm, I felt clarity. What I felt for Jimmy wasn't something I could just erase. It was something real, deep, and I needed to be honest with myself. I have always been a strong woman who faced difficulties head-on, and it would not be now that I would hide. So, the next morning, I prepared coffee with unusual calm. He appeared, as always, smiling and wishing me a good day. I looked at it in a different way. This time, I was decided. Jimmy, I said softly, we need to talk again. He immediately stiffened, clearly nervous. I smiled, trying to calm him down. I thought a lot about what you said. And I also have feelings for you. I could see the relief and happiness appear on his face. But before he said anything, I continued, but this isn't going to be easy. We're going to need to be careful. We need to understand what this means, not just for us, but for everyone around us. Jimmy approached and, for the first time, I allowed myself to hug him. It in a way that went beyond aunt and nephew. There, in the farm kitchen, we took the first step on a path that we knew was uncertain, but that we chose to follow together. Now that we had allowed ourselves to follow our hearts, I realized that the real challenge was just beginning. How would we deal with the world around us and ourselves? The days following our understanding were as calm as they were tumultuous. On the one hand, I felt a discreet happiness, a peace in knowing that, finally, I was being true to my feelings. On the other hand, I knew that our situation was not simple. We were surrounded by watchful eyes, families, and what would they say about our closeness? The farm, which had always been a refuge, now seemed full of mirrors, reflecting the dilemmas we needed to face. Jimmy and I spoke in whispers, always looking for a moment alone without arousing suspicion. He was as worried as I was, but also determined. He wanted, like me, for this to work. And it was during one of these conversations, by the stream where we used to walk, that he said something to me that made me stop completely. Aunt, what if we left all this behind? What if we left, to start a new life, in a place where no one knew us? For a moment, the idea seemed tempting. Freedom, the possibility of living without judgment. But at the same time, it was scary. Abandon the farm, which had always been my home. And my family. My friends? They would notice my absence. I felt torn between the desire to fully live this feeling and the responsibility for everything and everyone that was part of my life. I looked at Jimmy, who looked so young and full of hope. He still didn't understand the weight of the choices that life imposed on us. But I knew we needed to be cautious. We couldn't act on impulse. I understand you, Jimmy, but running away wouldn't solve things. We need to face this here, head on. He nodded, a little disappointed, but understanding. We knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but we decided to face them together. With the heavy clouds gathering above us, time seemed to speed up. What was once a small mystery was now an emotional dilemma that would shape our lives forever. The days passed and the tension in our house increased. Jimmy and I continued to meet secretly, but the external pressure only increased. Our family members began to notice the change in our behaviors. They felt like something was different, and that made me uneasy. Luckily for us, the tasks on the farm kept us busy, but even so, the exchanges of glances became more frequent and loaded with meaning. One morning, as I helped prepare breakfast, I heard the murmur of a conversation between my brother and mother in the next room. It was a subject that interested me, and, without meaning to, I ended up listening to their discussion. "She's not a kid anymore, but that doesn't mean she can just do whatever she wants," my mother said. His voice filled with concern. My heart accelerated. What were they discussing? Were they talking about me? Fear seeped into me like poison, and I realized I needed to be honest with them before things got even more complicated. This choice would be ours, but the impact on our family could not be ignored. The next day, I decided it was time to talk. I couldn't live with this weight alone, nor keep Jimmy in the dark about what was happening. The meeting was scheduled, and my heart was in a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't know how they would react. At dinner, as everyone gathered around the table, I swallowed hard. "I need to talk to you," I began, my voice shaking. Everyone turned to me, and my mother's worried look only increased my anxiety. About me and Jimmy. The faces around me changed, and the atmosphere became tense. "What do you mean, darling?" asked my father, concern written all over his face. I swallowed hard and prepared to open up. I like Jimmy. And it's not just a phase, it's a real thing for me." The silence that followed was almost deafening. I could feel the weight of expectation, but also understanding. I knew the conversation would be difficult, but it had to be done. Fate brought us together. And now we needed to face reality.